This story was told to me by an old friend of my mother's, Mrs. Donovan. In the early 1990s, they both lived in Greystone, a small industrial town that was slowly dying. My mother worked for the State Highway Department, and Linda Donovan worked at a local electronics factory. Those were dark times in Pennsylvania. Factories were laying off workers, salaries were delayed for months, and when they did pay, it was with food stamps or surplus from the warehouse. I was a child, but I still remember the smell of cheap canned food and the constant anxiety in the eyes of adults. Linda had 3 children and a husband, Frank, who worked at the same factory and often drowned his sorrows in cheap bourbon. The youngest, Penny, had just turned 4. Linda did what she could. On weekdays, she worked the assembly line, and on weekends, she sold things at the local flea market in the church parking lot. To feed her family, she sold her Sunday shoes and even her eldest son's collection of rare baseball cards. At times, Linda was overcome with despair. Penny's birthday was approaching. The girl dreamed of a porcelain doll from a shop window in the city center, but Linda didn't even have enough money for candles for a homemade cake. And, as luck would have it, Frank went on another long binge, gambling away the rest of his stash at a bar on the outskirts of town. Penny's birthday was on December 5th, and the 3rd was the anniversary of her older sister's death, who had died of leukemia 5 years earlier. It was a Saturday. Linda had no plans to go to the cemetery. In early December, an ice storm from the Great Lakes had hit the city. The temperature had dropped to record lows, and according to old beliefs, it was considered better not to disturb the dead in such cold weather. But on the morning of December 3, she woke up with a heavy feeling in her chest. She knew she had to go. Linda took the first commuter bus and arrived at the old Mount Hope Cemetery before dawn. There was a dead silence. So much snow had fallen that the gravestones looked like white ghosts buried in drifts. Linda strayed from the path, going deeper and deeper into the old part of the cemetery. It was beginning to dawn. One grave caught her attention. It was very fresh. The fence was decorated with long silver streamers, the kind usually used to decorate Christmas trees. The cemetery was so quiet that she could clearly hear the metallic, dry rustling of these streamers in the wind. God, what people will come up with, she thought as she approached. Instead of a permanent stone, there was a temporary wooden cross. The grave was literally covered with fresh roses and wreaths, which cost a fortune during the crisis. A blonde girl with bows in her hair looked at Linda from a framed photograph. Her name was Abby. She had died just 3 days ago, at the age of 5. Linda shook her head. What a tragedy for the parents. But somewhere deep inside, she felt a sharp, shameful pang of envy. People live different lives, while she counts every penny for bread. Here the grave is covered with flowers, and expensive chocolates lie on a saucer. But most importantly, next to the cross sat 2 dolls and a large teddy bear. The toys were clearly collectibles, expensive ones. They weren't sold in their small town. The bride doll attracted particular attention. Tall in a lush satin dress, with long jet black hair and a lace veil. The doll's face was porcelain, with such detailed features that it seemed as if she would blink at any moment. Linda said that in that moment her mind just went blank. She was consumed by a mix of envy and pure rage. The constant lack of money, her husband's drinking, the fact that she couldn't even give her own daughter a decent birthday. And yet this dead girl had everything. Her hand moved on its own. She grabbed the doll. She didn't ask the dead girl for forgiveness, didn't say a word. She just turned and ran from the cemetery as fast as she could. She only snapped out of it once she was already on the bus heading home. At first, Linda was terrified that she'd taken something from a grave, but then she pictured Penny's face when she saw the doll. Linda wasn't a religious person. She was raised to be practical and didn't believe in superstitions or sins. She pushed the dark thoughts away. On December 5th, she borrowed some cash from a coworker, baked Penny's favorite cake, and the older kids made handmade cards. It was a good birthday. Penny was obsessed with the doll. She took it everywhere, to daycare, to the dinner table, and to bed. She named her the Princess. A month passed. Linda barely remembered where the doll came from. She told her husband, Frank, that she'd saved up and bought it. Her conscience was clear, but then, out of nowhere, Penny got sick. a brutal, spiking fever. Linda stayed home to nurse her, but nothing worked. The fever stayed at 102, and Penny started to wither. She cried in her sleep and began to hallucinate. She complained that the princess was too cold, icy, like a block of frozen meat, and that it smelled bad. Linda checked the doll over and over. It was just plastic and fabric. It felt room temperature, and it smelled like Penny's shampoo. Another week passed. The doctors suspected pneumonia. Penny was fading fast. Linda stayed up every night by the bed. Penny kept crying about the doll being frozen, and then she said something that made Linda's blood turn to ice. She said a mean girl was coming to her room at night. She said the girl sang a terrifying song and tried to snatch the doll away. When Penny mentioned the girl, Linda immediately saw the face of little Abby from the cemetery photo. One afternoon, when the older children were at school and her husband was at work, Linda sat with Penny. The girl fell asleep hugging her doll, and Linda dozed off herself as she had hardly slept because of her daughter's fever. She was awakened by singing. A little girl was singing, but for some reason Linda felt very scared. She wanted to jump up and close the door to the room, but she seemed to be glued to her chair. She didn't know any prayers. Even the Lord's Prayer had flown out of her head. The singing grew closer, and finally the little girl entered the room. She didn't say a word, just sang. With 2 pigtails and a pretty polka dot dress, the girl stood and looked at Linda, then at Penny, continuing to sing. And her eyes, according to Linda, were not childlike, they were evil and transparent. Linda came to her senses 10 minutes later. She had fainted from fear. Penny was still asleep, hugging her doll. Maybe it was just a dream, but Linda grabbed the doll and, asking her neighbor to watch her daughter, rushed to the cemetery. It was already 6 o'clock in the evening, winter, dark. After about an hour, she found Abby's grave, fell to her knees, and begged her forgiveness for a long time. She placed the doll next to the other toys and ran away from there. Penny cried a lot and asked where her doll was, but the main thing was that her temperature dropped that same day. There was no miraculous healing that allowed the child to immediately get up and run around. Penny was nursed for another week, as she was very weak, but she no longer complained of nightmares. Now she is 24 years old, has 2 children, and a wonderful husband. She doesn't remember the doll, only sometimes saying that she has vague nightmares.